The Middle East has been here before. Sirens, explosions, emergency sessions at the United Nations. But what began before dawn on February 28, 2026 was different, categorically, historically, and terrifyingly different. In the pre-dawn darkness, a coordinated wave of Israeli and American airstrikes tore across Iran. Not surgical strikes at the margins, not a warning shot. Israel and the United States launched attacks on Iran, targeting its leadership, its nuclear and ballistic missile programs, and its armed forces House of Commons library, all at once in a single night. The objective, as stated by both governments, was unambiguous. They aimed to induce regime change in Iran and eliminate its nuclear and ballistic missile capability. House of Commons library, that is not the language of deterrence. That is the language of war. Within hours, the world began to grasp the magnitude of what had been set in motion. In addition to hitting military installations across Iran, the U.S.-Israeli operation targeted key government and military officials, with reports that Mohammad Pakpour, the commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and Iran's defense minister Amir Nasirzadeh had been killed. Security Council report. And then came the report that stopped the world cold. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed in the strikes. House of Commons library, the man who had ruled the Islamic Republic for over 3 decades, gone. Iran did not absorb the blow in silence. In response to the U.S.-Israeli military campaign, Iran launched missile and drone strikes against Israel, while also targeting countries in the region that host U.S. military facilities, including Bahrain, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Security Council report 9 countries pulled into the blast radius of a single night's decision. This is not a regional skirmish. This is not another exchange of strikes that fades from the headlines by the weekend. The current conflict bears little resemblance to last year's contained warfare. A drastic strategic pivot from degrading nuclear infrastructure to executing a decapitation strike against the Iranian leadership has shattered the previous rules of engagement, dragging the region into an open-ended war of attrition with zero diplomatic off-ramps. The question being asked in every capital from Washington to Beijing is no longer whether this conflict can be contained. The question is whether it already cannot. Could this war, this specific war, in this specific moment, be the trigger for something far larger? Could the Iran-Israel conflict pull in Russia, China, and NATO allies into a confrontation that reshapes the entire global order? Experts are warning, intelligence agencies are watching, and the world is holding its breath. We are going to walk through every dimension of this crisis and the strikes, the retaliation, the geopolitical fault lines, and the 2 scenarios that will determine whether history remembers February 28, 2026 as the beginning of a contained regional war or something far worse. If you want to understand what is actually happening, not the noise, not the headlines, but the real strategic picture, stay with us. And if you find this analysis valuable, subscribe now, because this story is moving fast and we are going to be here every step of the way. To understand why February 28, 2026 did not come out of nowhere, you have to go back. Not weeks, not months, decades. The hostility between Iran and Israel is not a product of recent policy. It is structural, it is ideological, and it has been building toward a moment like this for nearly half a century. When the Islamic Revolution swept Iran in 1979, it did not merely change a government. It transformed a regional ally of Israel into its most vocal existential enemy overnight. The new regime in Tehran declared Israel an illegitimate state, severed all diplomatic ties, and began funding and arming proxy forces across the region. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, and Shia militia networks across Iraq and Syria. These were not independent actors. They were instruments of a deliberate Iranian strategy: surround Israel, bleed it, and ultimately eliminate it. Israel, for its part, never treated this as rhetoric. Israeli intelligence services spent decades tracking Iranian nuclear ambitions with mounting alarm. Covert operations targeted Iranian nuclear scientists. Cyber attacks, most famously the Stuxnet worm, sabotaged Iranian centrifuges. Assassinations, airstrikes on weapons convoys, and quiet diplomatic pressure all formed part of a sustained Israeli campaign to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, a weapon Israeli officials described consistently and without ambiguity as an existential threat. For years, the United States served as a brake on direct Israeli military action against Iran. Diplomatic frameworks, economic sanctions, and back-channel negotiations, most notably the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, were presented as alternatives to armed conflict. Iran agreed to limit its enrichment activities. The deal held, briefly, until the Trump administration withdrew in 2018, reimposing sanctions and beginning what analysts would later call the final unraveling of the diplomatic track. Iran responded to the sanctions by accelerating its nuclear program, not slowing it. By 2024, Iran had significantly advanced its nuclear capabilities, stockpiling uranium enriched to 60%, just below the 90% threshold required for weapons-grade material. House of Commons Library international inspectors were blocked. Centrifuge counts multiplied. The window for diplomatic resolution was closing, and every serious analyst knew it. Then came October 7, 2023, the Hamas attack on Israel that killed over 1,200 people and dragged the entire region into open warfare. Hezbollah opened a northern front. The Houthis began attacking commercial shipping in the Red Sea. Iranian-backed militias targeted American forces across Iraq and Syria. What had been a cold shadow war became something unmistakably hotter. Throughout 2024 and into 2025, Israel and Iran exchanged direct strikes for the first time in their history. Iran launched an unprecedented drone and missile barrage at Israeli territory in April 2024. Israel struck back. Both sides pulled back from the brink, but neither side forgot. By late 2025, Israeli and American intelligence assessments converged on a single conclusion. Iran was weeks, not months, from nuclear breakout. The diplomatic track was dead. The deterrence track had failed, and the window for military action was closing. What happened on February 28, 2026 was not impulsive. It was the culmination of a decision years in the making, a decision that the risks of action had finally been outweighed by the risks of inaction. The question was never whether this moment would come. The question was always what would follow when it did. Now the world has its answer. To understand the full weight of what happened on February 28, 2026, you have to move past the headlines and into the operational detail, because the strikes that night were not a single event. They were a sequence, layered, coordinated, and executed with a precision that suggested months, if not years, of planning. The operation began in the hours before dawn. American B-2 stealth bombers operating from Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean delivered bunker-busting munitions against Iran's most hardened nuclear sites, Fordo, buried deep beneath a mountain in Qom, and Natanz, the heart of Iran's enrichment program. These were not symbolic strikes. The attacks targeted Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile programs with the explicit aim of eliminating its capability entirely. House of Commons Library. Simultaneously, Israeli F-35 squadrons, having transited carefully coordinated airspace, struck command and control infrastructure, air defense systems, and missile storage facilities across western and central Iran. The second wave was more surgical, and more consequential. Targeted strikes killed Mohammad Pakpour, the commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and Iran's defense minister, Amir Nasserzadeh. Security Council report. These were decapitation strikes, designed not merely to degrade Iran's military capacity, but to sever the command structure that would coordinate any coherent response. And then, in what American and Israeli officials would later describe only in the vaguest terms, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed, the architect of 4 decades of Iranian revolutionary foreign policy, dead. Wars are fought on maps, and to understand why the strikes of February 28, 2026 matter beyond the immediate human toll, you have to look at the map carefully and with full appreciation of what sits where and why. Iran is not a peripheral actor in the Middle East. It is the connective tissue of an entire regional order. It sits at the intersection of the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, sharing coastline with one of the most strategically critical waterways on the planet. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow choke point barely 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, is the passage through which approximately 20% of the world's traded oil flows every single day. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, all of their oil exports transit this strait. Close it, even partially, and the global economy registers the shock within hours. Iran has always known this. The Strait of Hormuz has been Tehran's ultimate strategic lever, the card it holds in reserve, the threat it deploys in moments of maximum pressure. And in the aftermath of the February strikes, that lever moved from theoretical to operational. But the strategic picture runs deeper than oil. The elimination of the IRGC command structure, specifically the killing of Mohammad Pakpour, was designed to do something specific: decapitate the organization that coordinates Iran's entire network of regional proxies. The IRGC's Quds Force is the operational arm that funds, trains, arms, and directs Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and the Iraqi Shia militias. Remove its leadership, and in theory, you sever the command and control links that make Iran's proxy network function as a coherent strategic instrument rather than a collection of independent armed groups, in theory. The practical reality is more complicated. Iran's proxy networks have spent decades building operational autonomy precisely as a hedge against decapitation strikes. The assumption that removing IRGC leadership would neutralize these groups underestimates the degree to which they have developed independent command structures, independent funding streams, and independent political legitimacy within their own societies. Al Jazeera: Hezbollah does not need a phone call from Tehran to fire rockets into northern Israel. The Houthis do not need authorization from the Quds Force to launch missiles at Red Sea shipping. These groups will continue to operate and in the absence of centralized Iranian restraint, they may operate with less caution, not more. The nuclear dimension carries its own strategic weight. If the strike successfully destroyed or severely degraded Iran's enrichment infrastructure, they have, at minimum, bought time. Israeli and American planners have always framed the military option in precisely these terms: not a permanent solution, but a delay, a window in which a new Iranian leadership, confronting the ruins of its nuclear program and the death of its supreme leader, might be compelled toward negotiation. But there is a countervailing logic that analysts are already voicing with urgency. A post-strike Iran, humiliated, leaderless, and facing an existential question about its own survival as a regional power, may draw precisely the opposite conclusion: that the only reliable deterrent against future strikes is accelerating, not abandoning, its nuclear program. The strikes may have destroyed facilities, but they cannot destroy knowledge. Iranian nuclear scientists, dispersed and surviving, carry that knowledge with them. And then there is the question of American military posture. U.S. military facilities across Bahrain, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE are now active targets of Iranian retaliation. Security Council report: these are not abstract assets. They are the forward operating bases, the prepositioned equipment depots, the air command hubs through which the United States projects power across the entire Middle East and Central Asia. If Iran can successfully strike these facilities, and it demonstrated on February 28th that it is willing to try, the United States faces a choice it has been avoiding for years: escalate further or reposition. Neither option is without consequence, and neither option is without risk of miscalculation. The strategic balance of the Middle East has not merely shifted, it has been dismantled. What replaces it, and who gets to shape the new order, is the question that will define the next decade. When events move at this speed, the instinct is to reach for certainty, to find the analyst, the general, the intelligence chief who will tell you exactly how this ends. But the most honest thing the expert community has done in the wake of the February strikes is resist that instinct and instead offer something more valuable: a clear-eyed assessment of what is known, what is probable, and what remains dangerously uncertain. The intelligence community's posture in the immediate aftermath of the strikes has been one of controlled alarm. Officials briefing congressional committees in closed session have described the situation as the most volatile Middle Eastern crisis since the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, and several have gone further, suggesting that the variables in play exceed anything analysts have had to model in the post-Cold War era. The central intelligence concern is not Iran itself. It is the reaction matrix, the cascade of decisions that other actors will now make in response to what they witnessed on February 28th. Analysts at leading international security institutes have warned that the killing of Khamenei and the decapitation of the IRGC command structure creates a dangerous power vacuum in Tehran. In the absence of a clear succession mechanism, multiple factions within the Iranian system, hardliners, pragmatists, military commanders, are now competing for control. That competition is not taking place in a stable environment. It is taking place in the middle of an active military conflict, with external pressure compressing the timeline for every internal decision. Al Jazeera. That power vacuum is, in the assessment of multiple geopolitical analysts, the single greatest source of unpredictability in the current crisis. A unified Iranian leadership, even a hostile one, is a known quantity. It has red lines, institutional interests, and a survival calculus that external actors can model and engage. A fragmented Iranian leadership with competing factions vying for legitimacy through demonstrations of toughness is something far more dangerous. Decisions made to consolidate domestic political power rarely align with decisions made for strategic coherence. Military analysts have focused particular attention on the Strait of Hormuz. Former senior naval officers have assessed that Iran retains the capability to conduct sustained harassment operations against shipping in the Gulf, even without centralized IRGC command, through submarine assets, fast attack boats, and pre-positioned mine warfare capabilities that do not require real-time authorization from Tehran. Al Jazeera. The disruption of Gulf shipping does not require a formal decision by an Iranian government. It requires only that enough local commanders decide independently that harassment serves their interests. Think tanks with deep regional expertise have raised a further concern that has received insufficient attention in mainstream coverage: the response of non-state actors operating outside direct Iranian control. Analysts warn that the strikes have created a martyrdom narrative that transcends the Iranian state, one that resonates across Shia communities in Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen, and which could generate retaliatory actions that no government, including what remains of Iran's government, can prevent or predict. Al Jazeera. On the nuclear question, weapons proliferation experts have offered an assessment that cuts against the optimism of those who frame the strikes as a definitive solution. The physical infrastructure of a nuclear program, centrifuge halls, enrichment cascades, storage facilities, can be destroyed by bunker-busting munitions. The intellectual infrastructure cannot. Iran's nuclear scientists, the institutional knowledge embedded in its engineering cores, the theoretical and practical understanding of weapons design that has been accumulated over 2 decades, none of that was destroyed on February 28th. Reconstitution, under a new leadership with even greater motivation and even less international goodwill, is assessed by proliferation specialists as a matter of when, not if. Academic voices from international relations and conflict studies programs have situated the current crisis within a broader historical framework. Decapitation strikes against state leadership, the removal of a head of government or supreme commander through targeted military action, have a troubled empirical track record. They rarely produce the political transformation that planners anticipate. More often, they produce intensified resistance, hardened public opinion against the attacking power, and successor leaderships that feel compelled to demonstrate resolve precisely because their legitimacy depends on it. The expert consensus, taken in its totality, does not support either unqualified optimism or unqualified despair. What it supports is this: the situation is extraordinarily fluid, the variables are numerous, the feedback loops between military action and political consequence are operating faster than any diplomatic framework can currently manage, and the margin for miscalculation by any actor on any side is vanishingly small. That is not a comfortable conclusion, but it is an honest one. But the other side has a point. In the aftermath of the February strikes, the dominant narrative in Western media and government communications has been one of justified necessity. Iran was weeks from a nuclear weapon. Diplomacy had been exhausted. The window was closing. The strikes were not a choice. They were an obligation. That narrative is coherent. It is argued by serious people with genuine expertise, and it deserves to be taken seriously. But so does the counter-narrative. And in the interest of intellectual honesty, which is the only kind of honesty that serves anyone well in a crisis of this magnitude, it must be examined with equal rigor. The first and most fundamental challenge to the dominant narrative concerns the intelligence itself. The case for the strikes rested on assessments that Iran was at the threshold of weapons-grade nuclear enrichment, weeks away from breakout. But intelligence assessments about weapons of mass destruction programs in the Middle East carry a specific and painful historical weight. In 2003, the world was told with comparable confidence that Iraq possessed active weapons of mass destruction programs. Those assessments were wrong. The consequences of acting on them reshaped the Middle East for 2 decades and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. That precedent does not prove the Iran assessments were wrong, but it demands that they be interrogated, not accepted as self-evident. Several European governments, notably Germany and France, privately communicated to Washington in the weeks before the strikes that their own intelligence services were less certain about the timeline than American and Israeli assessments suggested. Those reservations were noted. They were not acted upon. The second challenge concerns the strategic logic of decapitation. The elimination of Khamenei and the IRGC leadership was premised on the theory that removing the regime's command structure would either trigger regime collapse or compel a successor government toward negotiation. That theory has a poor empirical record. Historical precedents for CEUs, from the assassination of Hezbollah commanders to the killing of Qasem Soleimani in 2020, consistently show that decapitation strikes against ideological movements produce intensified resistance rather than strategic surrender. Soleimani's death did not weaken Iranian influence in Iraq. Within months, Iranian-backed factions had consolidated further control. The third challenge is diplomatic. Critics of the strikes, including several former senior American diplomats and at least 2 former national security advisors, have argued publicly that the diplomatic track was not, in fact, exhausted. Back-channel communications between Iranian pragmatist factions and European intermediaries had been ongoing as recently as late 2025. Those channels were not given time to produce results. The decision to strike was made, these critics contend, not because diplomacy had failed, but because certain actors had concluded that a negotiated outcome, one that left Iran intact as a regional power, even a non-nuclear one, was not the outcome they wanted. That is a serious allegation. It may be wrong, but it is grounded in documented diplomatic history, and it deserves more than dismissal. The fourth challenge concerns regional sovereignty. Iran, whatever its government's ideology and whatever its foreign policy conduct, is a sovereign nation of 90 million people. The strikes killed not only military commanders and a supreme leader, but Iranian civilians. The full casualty figures remain disputed, with Iranian sources reporting significantly higher numbers than those acknowledged by American and Israeli military spokespeople. Security Council report. The principle that sovereign states may be subjected to regime change military operations on the basis of their potential future capabilities, not confirmed current actions, sets a precedent that extends far beyond this conflict. China has noted it. Russia has noted it. Every state that sits in the crosshairs of a more powerful neighbor has noted it. None of this means the strikes were unjustified. Reasonable, informed, serious analysts disagree profoundly on that question, and that disagreement reflects the genuine complexity of the situation rather than bad faith on either side. What it does mean is that the path that led to February 28th was not inevitable. Choices were made. Alternatives existed, and the consequences of those choices, intended and unintended, will be borne not only by the governments that made them, but by the populations of an entire region and potentially far beyond it. History rarely assigns blame cleanly, but it does assign consequences. Until now, this has been a story about governments, militaries, and intelligence agencies, about decisions made in war rooms and command centers thousands of kilometers from most of the people watching this video. But what happens in the Persian Gulf does not stay in the Persian Gulf. And the consequences of what was set in motion on February 28, 2026 are already moving through the global system toward your economy, your energy bills, your security, and your daily life. Start with oil. The Strait of Hormuz remains open as of this recording. But markets do not wait for straits to close. They price in risk. And the risk premium attached to Gulf oil has surged to levels not seen since the early days of the Iraq War. Oil prices have spiked sharply in the wake of the strikes, with analysts projecting that a sustained disruption to Gulf shipping could push crude prices above $130 per barrel, a level that would translate directly into fuel price increases across every oil importing economy on the planet. Al Jazeera. That means higher petrol prices in Pakistan, higher diesel costs for farmers and truckers across South Asia and Africa, higher electricity bills in Europe, and higher inflation in economies that are already fragile from years of post-pandemic pressure. For the United States, the arithmetic is equally uncomfortable. American consumers, who spent much of 2024 and 2025 watching inflation slowly recede, are now facing the prospect of a new inflationary shock driven entirely by geopolitical events beyond their control. The Federal Reserve, which had been cautiously signaling rate cuts, is now confronting a scenario in which energy-driven inflation forces it back toward tightening, precisely the opposite of what a slowing economy needs. Global financial markets have responded with the volatility that always accompanies genuine uncertainty. Stock markets across Asia, Europe, and North America registered significant losses in the first trading sessions after the strikes, with defense sector stocks the notable exception, rising sharply as investors priced in the likelihood of sustained military expenditure across multiple governments. Al Jazeera safe haven assets, gold, the Swiss franc, U.S. Treasury bonds have surged. These are not the movements of markets that believe this crisis will be brief. The military consequences extend well beyond the immediate theater of conflict. NATO allies in Europe are watching the situation with acute attention. Several European governments have quietly accelerated defense procurement decisions that had been delayed for budgetary reasons. The strikes have reinforced the argument, made with increasing urgency since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that the era of strategic stability underwritten by American military dominance is giving way to something more contested and more dangerous. European defense ministers are not yet talking about direct involvement in the Iran-Israel conflict, but they are talking about readiness in ways they were not 6 months ago. Russia and China present a different and more complex picture. Both governments have condemned the strikes in the strongest diplomatic terms available to them. Russia, already deeply invested in its strategic partnership with Iran, has signaled that it is reviewing its military cooperation commitments, a signal that Western analysts interpret as a warning that Moscow may accelerate arms transfers to Tehran or its proxies. Al Jazeera China, which has spent years cultivating economic relationships across the Gulf region, including a landmark 25-year cooperation agreement with Iran signed in 2021, faces a direct threat to its energy security and its regional influence if the conflict destabilizes the Gulf states it depends on for oil imports. The alignment of Russian and Chinese interests against the American-Israeli position in this conflict is not incidental. It is structural, and it raises the question that sits at the heart of every serious analysis of this crisis. Are we watching a regional war, or are we watching the opening moves of a broader realignment between the Western-led order and the coalition of powers that have spent the past decade positioning themselves against it? For ordinary people watching this from Karachi, Cairo, Lagos, or London, the consequences are already tangible. Remittance workers in the Gulf states, millions of Pakistani, Indian, Filipino, and Egyptian workers whose earnings support families across the developing world, are living and working in countries that were struck by Iranian missiles on February 28th. The Gulf economies that absorb these workers, that generate the remittances that sustain entire national economies, are now active conflict zones. The human cost of this war is not confined to combatants. Energy prices, food prices, financial market volatility, regional security, the safety of diaspora communities, these are not abstract geopolitical variables. They are the texture of daily life for hundreds of millions of people who made no decision, voted for no government, and chose no side in this conflict. That is what it means when a war of this magnitude begins. The consequences do not respect borders. They do not stop at the edge of the conflict zone. They travel through pipelines and shipping lanes, through financial markets and supply chains, through the remittances wired home by workers in countries that are now under fire. This war has already arrived in your world. The only question is how deep it goes. We have covered a great deal of ground in this documentary, and before we look forward, it is worth pausing to establish with precision what we actually know and what we do not. What is confirmed? On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel conducted coordinated military strikes against Iran, targeting its nuclear program, its ballistic missile infrastructure, and its military leadership. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed. IRGC Commander Mohammad Pakpour and Defense Minister Amir Nasirzadeh were killed. Iran retaliated with missile and drone strikes against Israel and against American military facilities across 6 Gulf and regional states. The conflict is active. There is no ceasefire. There is no established diplomatic framework for de-escalation. Oil markets have surged. Global financial markets have registered significant losses. NATO allies are on heightened alert. Russia and China have condemned the strikes and signaled potential escalatory responses of their own. What remains uncertain, the true extent of damage to Iran's nuclear program, the composition and intentions of Iran's successor leadership, whether Iranian proxy forces will escalate independently and beyond the control of any central authority, whether Russia will translate its condemnation into material support for Iran, whether China will take any action to protect its regional economic interests, and most fundamentally, whether any actor in this crisis has both the intention and the capacity to create a credible off-ramp before the next escalatory move is made. Those uncertainties are not peripheral. They are the entire ballgame. Now look forward. 2 scenarios are being actively modeled by analysts, governments, and intelligence agencies right now. They represent not predictions, but the boundaries of a decision space that is narrowing with every passing hour. The first scenario is controlled escalation leading to a negotiated pause. In this scenario, Iran's successor leadership, whichever faction consolidates control in Tehran, makes a calculated decision that further direct confrontation with the United States and Israel is not survivable. Proxy activity continues, but is kept below the threshold that would trigger a second wave of American strikes. Back-channel communications facilitated by Qatari or Omani intermediaries establish a fragile preliminary framework. Oil markets stabilize. The Gulf states, shaken by the experience of being targeted by Iranian missiles, quietly accelerate their own accommodation with the new regional reality. The conflict does not end, but it finds a new equilibrium, lower and colder than before. This scenario requires multiple actors to make rational decisions under conditions of extreme stress, incomplete information, and intense domestic political pressure. It is possible. It is not guaranteed. The second scenario is uncontrolled escalation. In this scenario, the power vacuum in Tehran produces a leadership that concludes, correctly or incorrectly, that demonstrating resolve is the only path to domestic legitimacy. Proxy forces escalate without central restraint. A strike on American military facilities produces mass casualties, crossing a threshold that compels a direct American military response against Iranian territory. Russia interprets that response as confirmation of a Western strategy of regime change against any government it considers an ally and begins transferring advanced air defense or missile systems to Iranian-aligned forces. China, facing energy security disruption and domestic political pressure, moves to assert influence in the Gulf in ways that bring it into direct friction with American naval forces. In this scenario, the conflict does not stay regional. It becomes the framework around which a broader confrontation between the Western-led order and the Russia-China axis is organized, not World War III in the classical sense of declared belligerence, but something functionally equivalent, a global conflict fought through proxies, economic warfare, and the constant threat of direct confrontation between nuclear-armed states. That is the scenario that keeps serious analysts awake at night, not because it is inevitable, but because the conditions for it are more present right now than they have been at any point since the end of the Cold War. The coming days will be defined by specific moments worth watching closely. The formation of a new Iranian leadership structure, who emerges from which faction and with what stated intention, will be the single most important variable in the near term. Emergency sessions at the United Nations Security Council will test whether any diplomatic architecture can be assembled quickly enough to matter. American congressional hearings on the legal and strategic basis for the strikes will shape domestic political constraints on the administration's next moves. And the behavior of Iranian proxy forces across Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, and Gaza in the next 72 hours will signal whether the IRGC's destruction has produced restraint or has simply removed the last remaining brake on independent escalation. History is not made by abstractions. It is made by decisions, specific decisions made by specific people under conditions of uncertainty and pressure in the hours and days that follow moments exactly like this one. We are in those hours now. The world that exists on the other side of this crisis will be shaped by choices that have not yet been made. Some of those choices will be made by governments. Some will be made by military commanders in the field. And some, in ways that are never fully visible until historians reconstruct them decades later, will be shaped by the quality of public understanding of what is actually happening and why. That is why this analysis matters. That is why staying informed, not just consuming headlines, but understanding the strategic architecture beneath them, has never been more important. If this documentary gave you a clearer picture of one of the most consequential crises of our time, then do one thing before you navigate away. Subscribe. Because this story is not over. It is in many ways just beginning. We will be here, tracking every development, interviewing every credible voice, and giving you the analysis that the noise cannot. The world is at an inflection point. Be someone who understands it.